The helicopter came in low over the frozen reservoir, its blades kicking up a fine spray of snow that hung in the dead, windless air. On the ground, a young lieutenant colonel stood watching it settle, his breath freezing on the collar of his parka. His name was Don Carlos Faith. The night before, in the dark, his battalion had been hit by wave after wave of Chinese infantry coming down out of the hills, and his men had killed them in heaps and were still counting their own dead when the sun came up. Now a two-star general was stepping down out of that helicopter, immaculate, confident, freshly shaved, and Faith walked out to meet him with the worst news a commander can carry. He tried to tell the general the truth. He had been attacked by elements of 2 full Chinese divisions. This was not a patrol. This was not a screen. This was an army, and it was all around them. The general did not want to hear it. According to the United States Army's own official history of the war, a volume called Combat Actions in Korea, written by Russell Googler, the general told Faith, in effect, that the enemy delaying him was nothing more than the remnants of Chinese divisions fleeing north. He said the attack was still going forward, that they were going all the way to the Yalu River and the border with China, and then he said the line that the men who were there never forgot. Do not let a bunch of Chinese laundrymen stop you. Then he did something almost surreal. He had an aide bring up 3 silver stars, and he pinned them on the spot. One went on Faith, one went on a wounded lieutenant named Everett Smalley, who had been sitting on a water can waiting to be evacuated. One went on a mess sergeant who happened to be walking past. He congratulated them for their fighting spirit, climbed back into the helicopter, and lifted off into the white sky, back toward a warm headquarters far to the south. Faith stood in the snow and watched him go. Then he reached up, tore the metal off his parka, and threw it into the drift at his feet. When his operations officer asked what the general had said, Faith did not repeat the compliment. Roy Appleman, in his landmark study of this battle, a book called East of Chosin, records that Faith answered with 4 bitter words. You heard him. Remnants fleeing north. The wounded lieutenant, Smalley, looked at the medal in his own hand and said he had gotten himself a silver star and did not know what for. It was the morning of November 28th, 1950. The place was a village called Sinhong-ni on the frozen eastern shore of the Chosin Reservoir in the mountains of North Korea. And while an American general spoke of laundrymen and fleeing remnants, roughly 120,000 Chinese soldiers were already in the high ground around him, dug in, waiting, and ready to spring one of the great ambushes in the history of modern war. Within days, most of the men who received those medals would be fighting for their lives. Many of them would not survive. This is the story of how it happened. And it is not, at its heart, a story about one bad morning or one careless sentence. It is a story about 2 American generals who looked at the same mountains, read the same reports, faced the same enemy, and came to opposite conclusions about what was coming. One of them believed the Chinese were beaten and running. The other believed they were massing to attack. The one who was wrong outranked the one who was right, and he commanded them both. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and I know some of you have personal connections to it. Fathers, uncles, grandfathers who were at the reservoir, on the ice, on that road. I want to do it justice, because the deeper you go into the record, the clearer it becomes that the disaster east of Chosin was not simply bad luck or bad weather. It was a failure of judgment at the top, and it fits a pattern that this channel comes back to again and again. The pattern where the confident, well-connected man is trusted and the careful man who sees the danger is dismissed, and the price is paid by soldiers who had no say in any of it. The general in the helicopter was Major General Edward Almond, known to nearly everyone as Ned. To understand how he came to be standing in that snow telling a doomed battalion that the enemy was fleeing, you have to understand who he was and how he rose. Almond was a Virginian, born in Luray in 1892, and a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, class of 1915, where he finished 3rd out of 65. He was commissioned into the infantry, and in the First World War, he commanded a machine gun battalion in France in the Aisne-Marne and the Meuse-Argonne offensives. He was wounded in that war, and he earned the Silver Star for gallantry. I want to be fair to the man, and that record matters. Whatever else you say about Ned Almond, he was not a coward and he was not soft. He had stood in the fire himself as a young officer, and he carried the physical courage of that experience for the rest of his life. Between the wars, he did all the things an ambitious officer was supposed to do. He taught. He went to the Command and General Staff School and graduated in 1930. He attended the Army War College and the Naval War College. And somewhere along the way, he came into the orbit of George Marshall, a fellow Virginia Military Institute man whose good opinion could make a career. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to the making of the man in that helicopter. Marshall's favor helped carry Almond to the command that would shadow him for the rest of his life. In the Second World War, he was given the 92nd Infantry Division, the only black American division to fight as a full unit in that war, and he led it in Italy. The division's combat record was uneven, and it suffered close to 3,000 casualties. And here is where I have to be direct with you, because it goes to the heart of Almond's character. When the division struggled, Almond blamed his soldiers, and he blamed them in racial terms. He said the black soldier would not die for his country the way the white soldier would. He advised the army against using African-American troops as combat soldiers again. The historian Daniel Gibran, who studied the 92nd Infantry Division in Italy, concluded that Almond's own leadership was mainly responsible for the division's failures, not the men. And an army historian named Dale Wilson wrote an article about Almond and that division whose title tells you everything. He called it Recipe for Failure. The argument, and I think the evidence supports it, is that a division starved of good training, saddled with segregation, and led by a commander who did not believe in its men was set up to fail, and then the commander blamed the men for the failure he had helped create. I raise this not to convict Almond of the wrong crime, but because it reveals a habit of mind. Here was a man who, when things went wrong under his command, looked for the fault in his subordinates rather than in himself or in his own plan. Hold that thought, because you're going to see it again in the snow at Chosin. After the war, Almond went to Tokyo, and there he attached himself to the one man whose favor mattered more than Marshall's, Douglas MacArthur. Almond started in a minor personnel job, the kind that usually ends a career, but he impressed MacArthur with his energy, and by 1949, he was MacArthur's chief of staff for the entire Far East Command. When MacArthur planned the daring amphibious landing at Incheon in September of 1950, it was Almond, according to his biographer, Michael Lynch, who suggested the name for the assault force. They called it 10th Corps, and MacArthur gave Almond command of it. Now here is the arrangement that mattered, the one that concentrated power in a way the Army almost never allows. Almond did not give up his job as chief of staff when he took command of 10th Corps. He held both at once. He was simultaneously MacArthur's right hand in Tokyo and the commander of an entire corps in the field. And 10th Corps did not answer to the 8th Army, the main American force in Korea. It answered directly to MacArthur, which meant that if the 8th Army commander, Walton Walker, had ever wanted to complain about Almond, the complaint would have had to travel up through MacArthur's own chief of staff, who was Almond himself. Clay Blair, in his enormous history of the war called The Forgotten War, treats this dual arrangement as exactly the kind of favoritism that corrodes a chain of command. 10th Corps used its special access to grab supplies and priority, and it did so at the expense of the 8th Army. As for the man himself, one officer who knew him left behind a line that has followed Almond through every history written since. When it paid to be aggressive, Ned was aggressive. When it paid to be cautious, Ned was aggressive. Michael Lynch, who wrote the definitive biography, describes an abrasive, driving micromanager whom soldiers tended either to admire or to despise, with very little in between. During the Incheon planning, Almond, who had never conducted an amphibious operation in his life, asked whether the tracked landing vehicles that would carry the Marines ashore could actually float in water. The Marines did not forget that question. His aide during this period, incidentally, was a young first lieutenant named Alexander Haig, who would one day be a 4-star general and Secretary of State. There is one more thing I owe the man before I turn to his failures, and I want to say it plainly because fairness is the whole point of this channel. Michael Lynch, his biographer, argues that Almond's ugly views on race have to be read against the segregated army that produced them, an army that trained black soldiers poorly and then blamed them for the result. That does not excuse what Almond said, and I do not think it should, but it places him. And there is a private grief in his story that the record should not skip past. Almond lost his only son, an army officer, killed in action in Europe in that same Second World War, and he lost a son-in-law in the fighting as well. Whatever hardness there was in Ned Almond, the war had already taken from him about as much as it can take from a man. I hold both of those facts at once. A brave and grieving man can still be a dangerous commander, and the Chosin Reservoir is where those two truths met. That was the man in the helicopter. Brave, driven, brilliant in the eyes of his patron, contemptuous of caution, and carrying a lifelong habit of blaming the men below him when his plans went wrong. Now meet the other man, the one who saw it coming. Major General Oliver Prince Smith commanded the 1st Marine Division, and in almost every way, he was the opposite of Ned Almond. Where Almond was loud, Smith was quiet. Where Almond was a courtier who had risen close to the seat of power, Smith was a professional's professional. A tall, white-haired, pipe-smoking student of his craft who read philosophy and thought hard about the terrible arithmetic of his profession. Gail Scheisler wrote a biography of him called For Country and Corps, and the portrait that emerges is of a deeply serious man, cautious, not out of timidity, but out of a clear-eyed understanding of what mountains and winter and a determined enemy could do to an army strung out on a single road. The two men disliked each other almost from the moment they met, and the dislike was mutual and deep. Before Incheon, Almond lectured Smith on how simple an amphibious landing really was, a subject on which Smith, a career Marine, knew rather more than Almond ever would. And Almond called him son, though Smith was in fact several months older than Almond. It was the kind of small, needling condescension that a proud man does not forget. But the friction between them was not really about personality. It was about a fundamental disagreement over the danger they were in, and that disagreement is the engine of everything that followed. After the triumph at Incheon and the recapture of Seoul, MacArthur decided to drive north, all the way to the Yalu River and the Chinese border, and to end the war by Christmas. To do it, he kept his forces divided. The 8th Army pushed north in the west. Almond's 10th Corps pushed north in the east. Between them rose the spine of the Taebaek Mountains, and in that spine there was a gap, a stretch of empty, roadless high country where the two American forces lost contact with each other. Anyone looking at the map could see the danger. If the enemy came through that gap, or came down out of those mountains in strength, there was nothing to stop him. And Almond drove his corps into that country hard. His plan sent the 1st Marine Division up a single mountain road toward the Chosin Reservoir, and then northwest toward the Yalu, while the 7th Infantry Division pushed up the eastern side. By late November, according to modern accounts of the battle, 10th Corps was stretched across a front of roughly 400 miles in some of the worst terrain on Earth, in the dead of a Korean winter. The whole force hung on one narrow, twisting supply road that climbed 78 miles from the coast up into the mountains, through places whose names would soon be burned into Marine Corps memory. Sudong, Chinhung-ni, Koto-ri, Hagaru-ri, and at the far northern end, the village of Udam-ni. By the second half of November, MacArthur had a name for the drive north. He called it the offensive that would get the boys home by Christmas, and he said it out loud to the press, which meant that every soldier in Korea knew the plan and knew the deadline. That kind of promise builds its own momentum. It makes caution look like foot dragging, and it makes a careful commander look like a man standing between the troops and home. Almond pushed inside that momentum, and he pushed hard. He leaned on the commander of the 7th Infantry Division, Major General David Barr, to race his men toward the Yalu, and Barr had every reason to comply, because he knew Almond had been unhappy with his division's performance earlier in the campaign and was watching him closely. This is how a bad plan gathers speed. Not because any one man is stupid, but because everyone below the man in charge has a reason not to be the one who slows it down. Around the middle of November, a Siberian cold front rolled down over the peninsula, and the temperature collapsed. It fell to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and in places minus 40. Rifle bolts froze. Blood plasma froze in its bottles. Morphine syrettes had to be thawed in a medic's mouth before they would work. The ground was too hard to dig. This was the country Almond was ordering his men deeper into, chasing an enemy he insisted was already beaten. But that enemy was not beaten. And this is the part that turns Almond's confidence from a mistake into something harder to forgive. The warnings were not subtle. They were not hindsight. They were loud. They were repeated. And they arrived weeks before the trap was sprung. The first Chinese prisoner was taken at a place called Unsan on October 25, 1950. Days later, South Korean troops captured 16 more prisoners, and interrogation made clear that these were not stray volunteers. These were integral units of the Chinese army, committed against United Nations forces. Then, at the very end of October and into early November, the Chinese fell on the American 8th Cavalry Regiment at Unsan and mauled it. The 3rd Battalion of that regiment was effectively destroyed, losing something like 600 of its 800 men, and it was largely abandoned where it fell. An Army historian later called Unsan one of the most shameful and least known episodes in American military history. And then it got worse for anyone still claiming the Chinese were not there. Almond's own Marines ran straight into them. In early November, at Sudong, the 7th Marines fought and effectively destroyed a Chinese division, the 124th. They took prisoners, dozens of them. By the reckoning cited in the standard reference accounts, the Marines killed at least 662 Chinese soldiers in that fight. This was not a rumor of Chinese intervention. This was Chinese intervention in the flesh, in front of Almond's own troops, weeks before he flew into Sinhung-ni to talk about laundrymen. And the prisoners talked. Interrogators did not have to pry the truth out of them. Chinese soldiers taken in these fights described whole armies on the move to the south, division after division, exactly the kind of force that was in fact assembling in the hills above the reservoir. The evidence did not trickle in. It arrived in a flood, in the form of dead enemy soldiers, captured enemy soldiers, and identified enemy units with their home provinces and their commanders. Any honest reading of it pointed to one conclusion, that China had entered the war in massive strength and meant to fight. And yet the machine that was supposed to turn that evidence into a warning did the opposite. It took the flood, and it explained it away, one convenient assumption at a time. So why did the American command refuse to believe what was in front of its eyes? The answer starts in Tokyo, with a man named Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's chief intelligence officer, the man they called the G2. Willoughby had built his estimates around the assumption that China would not intervene in force, and when the evidence began to contradict him, he did not change the estimate. He explained the evidence away. When Willoughby personally flew forward and interviewed captured Chinese soldiers, he came back and insisted, according to the Army's official history, that only a battalion or so of volunteers from each identified division was actually in Korea. David Halberstam, in his masterful history of the war called The Coldest Winter, is blunt about what this was. Halberstam writes that Willoughby doctored the intelligence so that MacArthur's forces could go where they wanted to go, to the banks of the Yalu. One of Almond's own staff officers, the operations officer John Childs, said years later that Willoughby had falsified the intelligence reports and belonged in jail. This is the part the official communiques of the time glossed over completely. The intelligence was not merely wrong, it was bent to fit a conclusion that had already been reached at the top. And Almond, MacArthur's man, MacArthur's chief of staff, enforced that same optimism in the field. When Smith warned him that the Marine Division was becoming dangerously scattered along that mountain road, Almond brushed the warning aside as an old woman's excess of caution. When he flew into Faith's perimeter, he was not improvising. He was carrying the party line from Tokyo down to the men who would have to test it with their bodies. Now watch what the other general did with the same information. Because O.P. Smith looked at the same reports, the same prisoners, the same battle at Sudong, and he came to the opposite conclusion. And he acted on it in a way that came within a hair of open disobedience. Smith slowed his division down. Ordered to race north, he advanced deliberately, methodically, keeping his regiments within supporting distance of one another instead of flinging them up the road. He built up supply dumps along the route so his men would have ammunition and food and fuel when, not if, the blow fell. And, most consequentially of all, against the wishes of a corps commander who wanted speed above everything, Smith ordered his engineers to carve an airstrip out of the frozen ground at Hagaru-ri, in the middle of that mountain wilderness. It was an act, as more than one historian has put it, that came right up to the edge of insubordination. Smith also put his fears in writing. In a private letter to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Clifton Cates, Smith laid out his misgivings in language a subordinate rarely commits to paper. He wrote that a winter mountain campaign like this was asking too much of the American soldier or Marine. He wrote that he doubted he could even supply his troops or evacuate his wounded through that country in winter. He wrote that his left flank was wide open. And he wrote, in the most damning line of all, that he had little confidence in the tactical judgment of 10th Corps, or in the realism of its planning. Think about the position that put him in. Smith believed his superior was marching the division toward catastrophe, and he was very likely right, and yet he could not simply refuse a lawful order. So he did the only thing an honorable officer in that box can do. He obeyed the orders on paper while quietly preparing as hard as he could for the disaster he was sure was coming. That airstrip, that stockpile, that deliberate pace, those were not the acts of a timid man. They were the acts of a man saving his division from his own commander without ever quite saying so out loud. Smith's caution was not a vague nervousness. It was specific, it was professional, and it was written down at the time so that no one could ever claim it was invented after the fact. He looked at the single road his division was being sent up, a road that in places was little more than a track cut into the side of a mountain, and he understood that a force strung out along it could be cut into pieces that could not support one another. He understood that in that cold, on that terrain, an army that lost the initiative could simply cease to exist. He was not predicting a possibility. He was describing a near certainty if the Chinese were present in strength, which the evidence already said they were. Almond looked at the same road and the same map and saw only the path to the Yalu. That is the difference between the two men in a single image. One looked at that road and saw an opportunity. The other looked at it and saw a noose. And all the while, in the mountains above both generals, the trap was closing. The Chinese Ninth Army Group, under a commander named Song Shilun, had moved down out of Manchuria and into the Chosin high country entirely undetected. They marched at night. They hid by day under white cloth and in the folds of the ground, and they endured cold that killed their own men by the thousands rather than light fires that American aircraft might spot. By the time Almond was pinning medals on doomed soldiers, that army was already in position, coiled around the American columns on 3 sides. How big was it? This is one of the contested numbers in the whole story, and I want to give it to you honestly rather than pretend it is settled. The figure you will hear most often, the number of Chinese engaged in the battle, is around 120,000, roughly 12 divisions. That is the estimate carried in most modern accounts. The historian Alan Millett puts the full establishment strength of Song's army group higher still, at around 150,000 men across 3 armies, though he notes they were short of artillery, trucks, and shells, and desperately short of winter clothing. The difference between those numbers is mostly a matter of counting paper strength against the men actually in the fight, but the point that matters is not whether it was 120,000 or 150,000. The point is that it was an army, a vast one, and the American general responsible for that sector had just told a battalion commander that the enemy was a handful of fleeing remnants. The blow fell on the night of November 27 and into the early hours of November 28, 1950. And it fell everywhere at once. At Udam-ni, at the far northern tip of the American advance, the 5th and 7th Marines were hit by 2 Chinese divisions coming out of the dark. On the vital pass behind them, a place called Tok Tong Pass that guarded the only road back. Another Chinese division moved to cut the Marines off from the rest of the force. At Hagaru-ri, where Smith's precious airstrip was still being scraped out of the ice, yet another division attacked. At Koto-ri, further down the road, the Chinese cut the route again. And east of the reservoir, at Sinhung-ni, the same ground where Almond had pinned his medals, 2 Chinese divisions fell on Faith's task force and began to grind it to pieces. In a single night, an American corps that had been told it was chasing a beaten enemy to the Yalu found itself surrounded, cut into isolated pockets, and fighting for survival in temperatures that could kill an unprotected man in hours. The fleeing remnants had sprung the most complete ambush of the war. For the men in the foxholes, the attack came the way veterans of that war would describe it for the rest of their lives. First, the sounds in the dark, the bugles and the shepherd's whistles and the shrill blasts that the Chinese used to coordinate their assaults and to fray American nerves. Then the shapes coming on in waves, seeming to rise out of the snow itself, absorbing terrible losses and coming again. The Marines and the soldiers fought them off with rifles until the rifles froze, then with grenades, then with artillery fired so close it burst almost on top of their own lines, and finally, in places, with entrenching tools and fists. And behind every Chinese attack stood the second enemy, the cold, which killed the wounded who could not be moved, froze the plasma and the rations and the oil and the machine guns, and turned every simple task into a slow ordeal. A man who lay down to rest in that cold did not always get up. This was the reality underneath the phrase fleeing remnants. This was what the men on that road had been told not to worry about. And here I have to pause and say plainly what I believe, because the record earns it. The Chinese were never fleeing, not at any point that November. In the weeks before the battle, they had deliberately broken contact and pulled back into the mountains, precisely in order to lure the Americans deeper, to draw them up that road and away from support, and then to close the ring behind them. What Almond called a retreat was in fact bait, and he swallowed it whole, and he told the men on the ground to swallow it too. In my view, that is the true failure at Chosin. Not that the enemy achieved surprise, because a clever enemy sometimes will, but that the surprise was achieved against explicit, documented, repeated warnings that the American command chose not to believe. The shock of it reached all the way to Washington. MacArthur, who days earlier had promised the boys would be home by Christmas, now cabled home that his command faced an entirely new war against a fresh and powerful enemy. The offensive that was supposed to end the fighting had instead brought China into it at full weight, and the northern half of the American effort was reeling back toward the sea. I think it is worth stopping to take in the scale of what one set of wrong assumptions produced. Not a lost skirmish, a strategic reversal that changed the whole shape of the war, lengthened it by years, and cost a number of lives that is still being counted in the families who carry the memory. That is, what was riding on the simple question of whether the Chinese were fleeing or massing, and the men in the best position to answer it correctly got it wrong. What happened next is where the two generals' choices, the aggression and the caution, produced their opposite harvests. And the contrast is so stark that it reads almost like a controlled experiment in command. Start with the Marines. The men O.P. Smith had spent weeks quietly preparing to save. When the trap closed, they did not disintegrate. They fought as a division, because Smith had kept them able to fight as a division. On Toktung Pass, a single reinforced Marine company, Fox Company of the 7th Marines, under a captain named William Barber, held a frozen hilltop for 5 days and nights against everything a Chinese division could throw at them, keeping the escape road open. Barber was wounded and kept fighting and directing his men from a stretcher. A private named Hector Caffarata fought much of the action in his stocking feet, having had no time to get his boots on when the first attack hit, and he held a section of the line by himself long enough to matter. And he is credited with killing a staggering number of the enemy. Both men received the Medal of Honor. When Fox Company was finally relieved, fewer than 90 of its original strength of well over 200 were still on their feet. And they were relieved because of another act of grinding Marine will. A lieutenant colonel named Raymond Davis led his battalion off the road and straight over the mountains, through the snow, in the dark, and cold approaching 24 degrees below zero, marching cross-country for miles to break through to the surrounded company and reopen the pass. Davis, too, would receive the Medal of Honor. This is what Smith's preparation bought. Not safety. There was no safety at Chosin. But the ability to fight back as a cohesive force, to relieve a cut-off company, to hold a pass, to keep moving. Then came the long fighting withdrawal down the mountain, from Udom-ni back to Hagaru-ri, then to Koto-ri, then to the sea. Smith famously refused to call it a retreat. When a reporter used that word, Smith answered with a line that has been quoted in every Marine barracks since. Retreat? Hell, we are not retreating. We are just attacking in a different direction. And there was hard sense underneath the bravado. A division surrounded on all sides that wants to break out is, in fact, attacking. It has to punch through the enemy in front of it to get anywhere. Smith understood that, and he made his men understand it. Now the airstrip paid off, the one Smith had built against his commander's wishes. Over 5 brutal days, from the afternoon of December 1 to the evening of December 6, 1950, transport planes flew into that tiny frozen strip at Hagaru-ri and flew out 4,312 wounded and frost-bitten men, 4,312 soldiers, and Marines who would very likely have died in the snow if a careful general had not defied an aggressive one to build them a runway. When people ask what difference command judgment really makes, that number is the answer. Over 4,000 men alive, because one general prepared for the disaster his superior refused to believe in. Even the last barrier could not stop them. At Funchalen Pass, near the bottom of the mountain, the Chinese blew a bridge over a deep gorge at a power station, the one crossing that the division's vehicles and guns absolutely had to use. There was no way around it and no way to ford it. So the Air Force airdropped a bridge. 8 C-119 transport planes parachuted sections of an M2 treadway bridge down to the trapped column. The engineer officer had asked for 8 sections dropped in order to be sure of getting 4 usable ones onto the ground intact. Army and Marine engineers assembled them under fire, and on December 9, 1950, the vehicles rolled across and the division kept moving toward the sea. It is one of the most remarkable feats of combat engineering in American history, and it worked because Smith's division had held together well enough to hold the ground while it happened. The withdrawal itself was a feat of discipline that is hard to overstate. Smith brought his division down off that mountain as a fighting unit, not a mob. The Marines carried out their wounded. They brought out their dead where they could. They brought out their guns and their vehicles, fighting a rear guard the whole way and clearing Chinese roadblocks off the high ground above the road, one after another after another. When they finally came down into the coastal plain, and the temperature climbed and the danger began to ease, they marched in, filthy and frost-bitten and hollow-eyed, but in formation and in order. They had come out of a trap that should, by the plain arithmetic of it, have destroyed them. They came out because a general had refused to be hurried into the trap unprepared, and because the men themselves fought with a cohesion that only a well-led unit can hold together under that kind of pressure. Now turn to the other side of the reservoir. Turn to the men who had no O.P. Smith. East of Chosin, there was no carefully prepared division. There was a scratch force thrown together in a hurry that history remembers as Task Force Faith, part of the larger 31st Regimental Combat Team of the 7th Infantry Division. It was understrength, It was filled out with hundreds of Korean soldiers hastily attached to American units, many of whom did not speak English and had barely been trained. Its radios were unreliable, so its own units could not talk to one another. And in a detail that still makes me angry to read, many of its men were still wearing Summerfield jackets and 40 below cold because the supply system had not caught up to them. This was the force Almond had pushed up the eastern shore, and this was the force Almond visited and told not to worry about the laundrymen. What those men endured on the eastern shore deserves to be told in more than a summary. The task force had dug in around an inlet at the southern reach of the reservoir, and for night after night the Chinese came at that perimeter in the dark, and night after night the soldiers held, though the ring of enemy dead grew around their positions and their own wounded filled every truck they had. The regimental commander, Colonel Alan McLean, died in a way that captures the whole tragedy of confusion and false hope in that place. Seeing troops approaching across the ice, he believed they were the relief column coming up to link with him, and he walked out toward them across the frozen surface. And they were Chinese, and he was hit and taken and died a prisoner. Command passed to Faith, and Faith held that shrinking perimeter with no realistic prospect of rescue, because the units that might have relieved him were themselves surrounded, and the general who had sent him there had told him the enemy was fleeing north. So when Faith finally ordered the breakout, he was not attacking toward victory. He was trying to save the living by carrying them out through an enemy that was, by then, everywhere around him. There was no airstrip built for these men, no stockpile dumps waiting along their road, no general willing to slow down and defy 10th Corps on their behalf. The regimental commander, Colonel Alan McLean, disappeared in the fighting and was captured, and later died of his wounds, and command fell to Faith, the man who had thrown the medal into the snow. For days, Faith's men held their perimeter against night after night of Chinese assault, and their casualties mounted into the hundreds, with nearly 600 wounded packed into their trucks and no way to evacuate them. Finally, on December 1, 1950, Faith made the only decision left to him. He gathered what remained of his command, loaded the wounded onto a convoy of trucks, and tried to break out to the south, down the road toward the Marine lines in safety. It became a nightmare. At the head of the column, a friendly aircraft, trying to help, dropped napalm short and hit Faith's own men. The convoy ran into roadblock after roadblock. Faith led assaults to clear them, and somewhere on that road he was mortally wounded. He would receive the Medal of Honor for it, decades later. Without him, the breakout came apart entirely. The column was shot to pieces, and men scattered off the road and out onto the frozen surface of the reservoir itself, staggering across the ice toward the Marine positions. And here, one more time, the Marines reached out to save Army lives. A Marine lieutenant colonel named Olin Beale drove jeeps and sleds out onto that ice, again and again, under fire, and personally pulled more than 300 wounded and frozen soldiers off the reservoir to safety. But the arithmetic of what happened east of Chosin is devastating, and it is the hardest set of numbers in this whole story. According to the United States Army Historical Foundation, of the men who tried to break out, just over 1,000 eventually reached the Marine lines, and of those, only 385 could be considered able-bodied. 385. The task force had numbered in the thousands. By the middle of December, of the roughly 1,777 American soldiers of the 31st Regimental Combat Team who had been positioned at the reservoir, some 1,392 were listed as missing in action, which meant either dead and unrecovered or captured. That is the price of the Eastern Shore. A regimental combat team effectively annihilated, casualties running as high as 90 to 95%, in the same battle where, a few miles west, a Marine division fought its way out intact. I want to be careful and fair here, because the difference was not that Marines were braver than soldiers. The men of Task Force Faith fought with tremendous courage. Their commander earned the nation's highest award for valor. The difference was preparation and command. The Marines had a general who had defied his superior to get them ready. The Army Task Force had a general who told them the enemy was fleeing and pinned medals and flew away. Same battle, same cold, same enemy. Opposite outcomes, driven by opposite judgments at the top. The Chinese, for their part, paid a staggering price of their own, and this too belongs in the record for the sake of honesty. Song's army group was wrecked. American estimates of Chinese losses across the battle range widely, from as low as 35,000 up toward 60,000 killed, wounded, and lost to the cold, and the Marine Corps history estimated on the order of 25,000 Chinese killed and another 12,500 wounded. Whole Chinese divisions ceased to exist as fighting units. Appleman notes that the two divisions that destroyed themselves attacking Faith east of the reservoir, the 80th and the 81st, were so shattered that they were not identified on the battlefield again until the following spring. The men who sprang the trap were themselves ruined by the winter they had used as a weapon. Even the Marine casualty figures are disputed, and I would be doing the story a disservice if I pretended otherwise. The 1st Marine Division's own accounting put its battle losses at over 600 killed, with more than 3,400 wounded, and thousands more men taken out of the fight by frostbite and the cold. The headquarters above it, 10th Corps, recorded lower battle figures, closer to 400 killed. Historians have argued over that gap ever since, and the difference comes down to how you count a man frozen half to death but still breathing, and how a headquarters tallies the cost of a battle it would rather remember as a triumph. I give you the range rather than a false precision, because the men who study this deserve the truth about what we do and do not know. The whole American force in the Northeast now fell back to the port of Hungnam and was taken off by sea in one of the great evacuations in military history. Through the second half of December into Christmas Eve, the Navy lifted out around 105,000 troops, close to 100,000 North Korean refugees who did not want to be left behind, some 17,500 vehicles, and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies, and then blew the port to rubble behind them. One merchant ship alone, the Meredith Victory, crammed some 14,000 refugees aboard and carried them to safety. President Truman called the whole operation the best Christmas present he had ever received. And in fairness to Almond, the evacuation itself was competently run, which tells you the man was not incompetent in the ordinary sense. He could execute. His failure was not one of skill, it was one of judgment and of the willingness to believe what he wanted to believe. So what happened to these men afterward? Here is where the story stops being about one battle and becomes about something larger, something that I think matters more than the tactics. Because if the reservoir was a test of judgment, the years that followed were a test of the institution. And the institution failed that test almost completely. Consider Ned Almond, the general who got it wrong, the man whose corps had been surrounded because he refused to believe the warnings. What became of him? He was not relieved. He was not disgraced. When Matthew Ridgway took over the war, he came to regard Almond as his best corps commander and recommended him for promotion. Almond pinned on his 3rd star and became a lieutenant general in February of 1951. In July of that same year, he was made commandant of the Army War College, the very institution charged with teaching the next generation of officers how to think about war. He retired in 1953, went into the insurance business, sat on the board of his old military college, and was in time buried with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The system did not merely tolerate Ned Almond, it rewarded him, promoted him, and handed him the job of shaping the minds of the officers who would come after. There is a small telling coda to that reward. Almond's years running the Army War College were later touched by a minor scandal over the lavish renovation of his official residence, an affair that earned him a letter of reprimand. Sit with that for a moment. A letter of reprimand over the cost of decorating a house. That was the sharpest official rebuke the United States Army ever handed Ned Almond. Not for the corps surrounded in the mountains, not for the task force destroyed on the eastern shore, but for an expensive renovation of his quarters. It is almost a parody of institutional priorities, and yet it is exactly true, and it tells you everything about how gently a confident, well-connected favorite was handled even on the rare occasion when he stumbled. Now consider O.P. Smith, the general who got it right, the man whose caution and quiet defiance saved a division, and through that airstrip, saved over 4,000 wounded men. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, and he did eventually retire a 4-star general, so I will not pretend he was cast out. But his relationship with his own superiors was strained, and his career did not carry the golden charm that Almond's did. And here I have to be honest about Smith too, because this channel does not do hagiography. When the 1st Marine Division received a Presidential Unit citation for Chosin, the Army units that had fought and died east of the reservoir were left off the recommendation. And by several accounts, that omission was made at Smith's direction on incomplete information in the confusion after the battle. Even the man who was right cast a shadow. The soldiers of Task Force Faith would pay for that omission for half a century. And the men who had made Smith's stand possible did not all fare well either. The engineers who scraped that airstrip out of the frozen ground, the officers who held the passes and cleared the roadblocks, many of them went back afterward to ordinary careers and ordinary promotions. Their part in one of the great fighting withdrawals in American history folded quietly into the record. That is the thing about being right inside an institution that rewards confidence over judgment. Being right is its own reward, and often it's only one. There is no medal for the disaster that did not happen because you prepared for it. There is no promotion for the catastrophe you prevented by being cautious when caution was unfashionable. The men who avert the worst are, almost by definition, the men whose foresight leaves nothing dramatic behind to point at. Ned Almond got a Corps command and a 3rd star. O.P. Smith got to keep his division alive. Only one of those 2 achievements came with a parade. Because consider finally the men east of the reservoir, the men who received nothing at all for the longest time except suspicion. In the aftermath, a chaplain who had served with the Marines accused the Army task force of cowardice, and because so many of its officers were dead or in Chinese prison camps, there was almost no one left alive and free to defend them. The men who had held a perimeter for days in 40 below cold, whose commander had won the Medal of Honor leading them, were slandered as men who had run, and the record was allowed to stand. It took the opening of Chinese archives in the 1990s and the dogged work of historians, above all Roy Appelman in east of Chosin, to finally establish what those soldiers had actually endured and actually accomplished. Only then was the record corrected. The Secretary of the Navy, Richard Danzig, approved a presidential unit citation for the men east of Chosin in September of 1999, and it was presented to the surviving veterans in the year 2000, at ceremonies marking the 50th anniversary of the battle. 50 years. It took 50 years to say that those men had not run. And Don Carlos Faith himself, the young lieutenant colonel who threw the medal in the snow, his body was left behind on that frozen road in 1950, and it lay in North Korean ground unrecovered and unidentified for more than 60 years. His remains were finally identified in August of 2012, and in April of 2013, he was at last laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, in the same ground where the general who told him the Chinese were fleeing had already been buried in honor for decades. I want to sit with that contrast for a moment, because it is the whole point. The general who was wrong got his 3rd star in command of the War College within months. The lieutenant colonel who was right, and who died proving it, waited more than 60 years just to come home, and his men waited 50 just to be told they had not been cowards. This is the pattern that this channel keeps finding, in campaign after campaign, and it is why the story of the reservoir belongs alongside the others. The American Army of that era had a structural blind spot. It was very good at rewarding the officer who radiated confidence and stood close to power, and very bad at listening to the officer who saw the danger clearly and had the discomfort to say so. Almond had everything the system valued. He had the aggression, the connections, the patron in MacArthur, the certainty. Smith had judgment, and judgment is quiet, and judgment often sounds like caution, and caution reads as weakness to men in a hurry to win a war by Christmas. The system could see the difference between a bold man and a timid one. What it could not see was the difference between a bold man who was right and a bold man who was wrong. And if any of this sounds familiar, if you have spent your working life watching the confident talker get promoted while the careful person who actually understood the problem got told to stop being so negative, then you already understand the reservoir better than any map could teach you. The pattern did not begin at Chosin, and it did not end there. It is older than any of us, and I suspect it will outlast us all. The historians who have looked hardest at this battle do not soften it. David Halberstam, in The Coldest Winter, casts Almond and Willoughby as the courtiers around MacArthur who refused to believe the plain evidence of the battlefield because the truth was inconvenient to the plan. Martin Russ, in his account of the campaign called Breakout, is harder still, writing of a corps commander whose complacency very nearly got every one of his men killed. And Roy Appelman, who spent years reconstructing what happened east of the reservoir, wrote of that ordeal in words I have not been able to shake. He described a story whose hallmarks were misery, soul-crushing cold, privation, exhaustion, heroism, and finally disaster. And he said it would be hard to find a more nearly hopeless or more tragic story in all of American military history. Clay Blair, whose history of the war is among the most detailed ever written, lays the command failure out step by step, and the picture that emerges is not of a single mad decision, but of a steady refusal up and down the chain to let inconvenient facts change a plan that powerful men had already committed to. And more than one modern account treats the destruction of Task Force Faith as a case study in exactly the failure, singling out Almond for driving his units forward and brushing aside the warnings that a numerically superior Chinese force was closing in around them. The verdict of the record, taken as a whole, is not that Ned Almond was uniquely wicked. He was not. It is that he was the sharp end of a system that had stopped listening and that the men on the eastern shore paid the bill that the system had run up. I think Appleman was right, and I think the tragedy is sharpest, not on the battlefield, terrible as it was, but in the ledger afterward. Because the reservoir was survivable. The Marines proved it was survivable. What was not survivable was the judgment of a commander who preferred a comforting story to a true one, and an institution that, when the smoke cleared, pinned its medals on the man who told the comforting story and left the men who lived the true one out in the cold for 50 years. That is the reservoir. 2 generals, 1 road, 1 winter. One of them believed the enemy was fleeing, and he was rewarded for it. One of them believed the enemy was coming, and he saved his division by quietly defying the first, and he was passed over for it. And between them, on the frozen eastern shore, lay the men of Task Force Faith, who were told not to let a bunch of laundrymen stop them, and who died holding a perimeter that their own country would not honor until almost every one of them was gone. If your father or your grandfather served at the Chosin Reservoir with the 1st Marine Division, with the 7th Infantry Division, with the 31st Regimental Combat Team, or aboard the ships at Hungnam, I would truly like to hear about it. Those stories matter, and they matter more every year. Drop them in the comments below. That is the story. The sources are in the description. I will see you in the next one.